Hannah, how a mother's anguish led to redemption. When I was a young pastor in my late 20s, I purchased an out-of-print book, secondhand, for 25 cents. It was entitled A Man Called Peter, written by Catherine Marshall. And this book had a profound influence on the early part of my ministry, and even to some extent today. Her husband, Peter Marshall, was a well-known, beloved pastor in Washington, D.C., who served as chaplain of the Senate in 1947. At the height of his career, in 1949, at the age of 47, Peter Marshall suffered a fatal heart attack. And Catherine became a widow at 35. The book, and later a 1955 movie, also entitled A Man Called Peter, is about the inspirational life of this godly minister. But of importance to us on this beautiful Mother's Day is what happened to a mother named Catherine. In 1943, when Catherine was 29 years old, she was stricken with an especially stubborn case of tuberculosis. At first, the doctors thought it was temporary and that she just needed some bed rest, and so the young mother carried out her responsibilities from bed, optimistic for recovery. But 18 months later, a year and a half, there was no improvement. Best doctors in the country, with the treatments available in the 1940s, were unable to help this 29-year-old mother. Their only prescription was wait and rest. All of us at Community Church at Sun Village are hopeful that we'll be back to church in a few months at the most. What if 18 months from now we're still sheltered down with no end in sight? What would you do? Catherine went through deep soul searching. Now, she believed Jesus did miracles, so she wondered why Jesus didn't heal her. Well, perhaps sin was blocking the miracle. And so she writes, painfully and in agony of mind and spirit, I began thinking back over my life, recalling all too vividly all my transgressions and omissions, putting these on paper, claiming God's promises of forgiveness and cleansing. When this thorough task of confession was completed and letters of forgiveness were sent, I boldly asked God to make me well. Confidently, with what I believed to be real faith, I waited the verdict of my next x-ray. But they were the same. I was puzzled and hurt, she writes. The barometer of my faith fell sharply. It appeared that God had failed me. I was desperate. I was at rope's end. During this time, she read a pamphlet about a former missionary bedridden for 8 years. During the long illness, the missionary asked, "Why am I on the shelf when I could be out there doing your work?" With unrecognized rebellion in her heart, the missionary repeatedly prayed, "God, make me well so I can return to missionary work." But nothing happened. And these prayers of anguish went on for 8 years. Now, I begin this way to set the stage for our Old Testament text from the life of a godly mother who was overwhelmed with anguish. And this anguish led her to pray what Catherine Marshall will one day call a prayer of relinquishment. And this prayer led to redemption, and thus the title of my sermon, How a Mother's Anguish Led to Redemption. Here's how it happened. There was a certain man whose name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Before we continue, I should say a word about Elkanah's polygamy. In Old Testament times, Elkanah's polygamy was culturally acceptable and legal. It was a practice for someone whose wife could not bear him children, sort of like abortion in reverse. But abortion to get rid of children and polygamy to produce children are not in accordance with God's design. From the beginning, God designed for marriage is one man, one woman for a lifetime in order to be fruitful and multiply and not get rid of children if they're inconvenient. Genesis 2:4 and following. But at this stage in redemptive history, God allows the natural consequences of polygamy to reveal polygamy for the perversion of marriage that it is. Elkanah, no matter how he tried, couldn't really love both of his wives. And therefore, ironically, he loved neither. Just as a mother, in the name of loving herself, cannot love the child she aborts. And then she ends up loving neither herself or the child. And that, again, is the ironic perversion. But the main point of this text, the thing we will be looking at, is how God amazingly used the anguish that resulted from polygamy to bring about redemption. As we shall see, Hannah becomes a type of Christ, whose Gethsemane anguish results in redemption and then salvation of her people. Here's how it happened. Every year, Elkanah went up to worship and sacrifice to the Lord at Shiloh, and he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her. Everyone could plainly see that Peninnah was cared for, but Hannah was the one Elkanah loved. What no one could see, and only a divine author could reveal, is that the Lord closed her womb. And Hannah must have wondered, as Catherine Marshall wondered, did I sin? Is God punishing me? The text doesn't answer her questions directly, but it does tell us the result of God closing her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, note the divine author's connection, because her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. What do you think? Is God responsible for Peninnah's shaming of Hannah? No, but he is responsible for closing her womb. And surely God knew the shaming that would result from this closed womb, would he not? This is the mystery of God's providence, which Peter teaches in his Pentecost sermon. Look at the parallel between what happened to Hannah and what happened to Jesus. Peter preaches, "This man," referring to Jesus, "was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge." Likewise, it could be said Hannah was handed over to Peninnah by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. He closed her womb. Peter continues, "And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross." The men were wicked, and they were responsible for their sin, not God. Just as Peninnah was, in this instance, wicked and responsible for shaming Hannah, not God. Peter continues, "But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death." Do you see it? God redeems what wicked men did according to his foreknowledge. This is the redeeming mystery of God's providence. Likewise, as we shall see, God redeems Peninnah's shaming according to his foreknowledge. Elkanah would say, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Notice how Elkanah, in the name of love, shames Hannah. Because see, no matter what he says, no matter what he pleads, his polygamy shouts louder than words that Hannah's failure to produce even one child, much less 10, is a snare to her husband. And this shame causes Hannah anguish, and this anguish brings her to the two choices of anguish. What are these two choices? Let's look. The choices of anguish. Number 1, trust self to remove it. Or, number 2, trust God to redeem it. Both Hannah and her husband, Elkanah, experienced the anguish of not having children. So Elkanah chose to remove it by violating God's revealed standard, one man, one woman, for a lifetime. Genesis 2, verse 4. Now keep in mind, Elkanah didn't take several wives or a mistress for carnal pleasure. He took a second wife to, in his mind, be fruitful and multiply as God commanded. And he provided for both his wives. Nevertheless, although Elkanah's polygamy was culturally acceptable human solution and legal, it represents trusting self to remove a problem, just as abortion is a culturally acceptable, legal, human solution that represents trusting self to remove a problem. Hannah could have gone the route of removal. For example, she could have tried to remove Peninnah, like Sarah removed Hagar, or at the very least sabotage Peninnah's attempt to have children. Or Hannah could have tried to remove herself from God by becoming bitter and angry at God, or an I don't care resignation. Or she could have paid Peninnah back in kind, shaming her for something, finding something in her background that she could shame her with. It's not hard to think of many passive and aggressive ways removal is manifested. Some people rebel by quitting the church altogether. Others by private rebellions. I'll watch what I want to watch. I'm an adult. I don't care what Jesus thinks about those shows. Some do it in their mind. I'll think what I want to think. It's nobody's business if I think less than holy thoughts about another person, as long as I don't actually act upon it. Some adopt culturally acceptable legal practices to relieve the stress and think, surely God will understand. But Hannah, to her credit, rejected removal in favor of redemption by praying a prayer of relinquishment. Here's how it happened. In Shiloh, Hannah stood up to pray while Eli the high priest was watching her. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow. O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. Hannah's vow sounds like a bargain with God, a quid pro quo. If you, Lord, do this, give me a son, then I will do that. But is it a bargain? Only if she gains something. But Hannah essentially prays, if you give me what I want, a son, I'll give him back to you. Completely. Her prayer was no more a bargain than Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane was a bargain. It was, in fact, a prayer of relinquishment. Not my will, but thy will, O Lord. This is not, I don't care, resignation, or I'll do what I want, rebellion, or I'm just going to sit back, let God do whatever he's going to do. No. This is spirit-empowered relinquishment to God's will, even if it means going to the cross. This is a type of Gethsemane prayer. And as is true of Jesus' Gethsemane prayer, it was misunderstood by a religious leader. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli, he happened to be the high priest, thought she was drunk and said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Eli the priest rushes to judgment, thinking Hannah is drunk, just as some in the crowd at Pentecost rushed to judgment, thinking the apostles were drunk. Hannah, like Peter at Pentecost, was drunk all right, but not with wine, but with God's Spirit. And so she explains, just as Peter explained in his sermon, I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Hannah's anguish and grief brought her to the place where she relinquishes her will to God's will. And in the midst of that relinquishment prayer, she was prompted by God to make a solemn, costly vow akin to taking up one's cross. She didn't plan this vow. She didn't make a vow she was taught as a little girl or heard somebody else make. There is simply no precedence for mothers of that day making such a vow. It just came out, prompted by God. In 1968, when I was 17, I was what you would call religious. But I had never really trusted Christ to be my Savior. Indeed, I wouldn't have even known what that meant. I'd never even heard the term. So I prayed as a teenager for the kind of things such a religious teen might pray for. Good grades. Check. A girlfriend. Again. Check. My beloved Detroit Tigers and my hero Al Kaline to win the World Series in 1968. Check again. Down 3-1, they came back. And I was on a roll in my prayer life. But 1968 turned to 1969, and my teenage life crashed, and I melodramatically wondered how I could carry on. Removal seemed like a plausible solution. In anguish, I was prompted by God to pray. Something like this: Jesus, I don't even know if I want to live, but if you want me to live, then you're going to have to come into me and live through me. There was simply no precedence for such a prayer. I never heard anybody pray like that. It was not the kind of prayer anyone in my religious background would pray. It just spontaneously popped out, prompted by God. God's mysterious providence orchestrated circumstances to bring me to a place of anguish. And in that anguish, I voluntarily made a vow of commitment to Jesus. And Jesus redeemed my life. Ravi Zacharias, the now famous apologist, when he was 17, his anguish actually caused him to attempt suicide, removal. He frequently talks about this. He was on a bed of suicide when he met the Lord. Redemption. And this brings us back to the choices of anguish. Number 1, trust self to remove it. Like Elkanah. Or take revenge, like Samson. Or give in to despair, like Judas. Or number 2, trust God to redeem it. And Hannah, as a type of Christ, is a perfect example of this. And oh, did God ever redeem Hannah's shame? Early, the next morning, they worshiped before the Lord and then went back to their home at Ramah. And the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel. God's mission for Samuel will require unique training. When he is 7, Samuel will receive a message of judgment from God to present to Eli the high priest that would make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. Imagine a child giving a prophecy of God's judgment to a bishop or a pope or a denominational leader. Samuel would go on to become a prophet, a priest, a judge. And he would prophetically anoint young Daniel to become the king through whom the Messiah would come. And none of this would have happened if Samuel was raised by his mother in the hill country of Ephraim. Again, we're faced with the mystery of God's providence. God redeems our anguish according to his foreknowledge. We all experience anguish, and that anguish always brings us face to face with two choices. Trust self to remove it, or trust God to redeem it. And this brings us to how God redeemed Catherine Marshall's anguish. Catherine Marshall's breakthrough began with the missionary she read about in that pamphlet, the one who prayed for 8 years, "God, make me well so I can return to missionary work." Finally, this missionary relinquishes herself to the Lord. "All right, Lord, I give in. If I'm to be sick the rest of my life, I bow to thy will. I want thee even more than I want health. It is for thee to decide." Thus, this missionary left herself entirely in God's hands and felt a peace she had never known before. 2 weeks later, she got up entirely well and went back to work. Unbelievable. She had been sick for 8 years. Could it really be that this relinquishment was what God was waiting for? Catherine read and reread that pamphlet, and suddenly an inner illumination playing on that missionary's experience revealed her prayer mistakes. I had been demanding of God. I had claimed health as my right. The right way must be that of submission and surrender to God's will. Not I don't care resignation or some sort of passive-aggressive rebellion, but what she will later call the prayer of relinquishment. Privately, with tears, I lay in bed and prayed. "Lord, I've done everything I've known how to do, and it hasn't been good enough. I'm desperately weary of these struggles of trying to persuade you to give me what I want. I'm beaten, whipped, and through. Here I am. Do anything you like with me." There was nothing victorious, nothing expectant. I had no faith as I understood faith, says Catherine. Nevertheless, a strange peace settled into my heart. And that was the beginning of her healing. Didn't come instantly, but the next x-ray showed improvement. For the first time in 3 years. And she was now on the path to healing. Does the prayer of relinquishment always result in healing? No, but it always results in redemption. When we stop trusting self to remove it and relinquish ourselves to God, He in His mysterious providence will always redeem it. Let's call this relinquish to redeem. And the Bible describes it in many and various ways. Let's say out loud together a few of these verses, but before we do, fix in your mind something, or perhaps someone, that causes you anguish. And let's begin with Psalm 55:22, which, as you shall see, sounds like a familiar New Testament verse. For you see, the New Testament is not something new and different, but the fulfillment and the completion of the Old Testament. Cast your cares on the Lord, and He will sustain you. Relinquish. He will never let the righteous be shaken. Redemption. 1 Peter 5:7. Cast all your anxiety on Him. Relinquish. Because He cares for you, and His care always leads to redemption. Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened. Relinquish. And I will give you rest. Redemption. Matthew 11:29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. Relinquish. And you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Redemption. Our closing hymn is fittingly, Have Thine Own Way, Lord, which is the ultimate relinquishment. Before Daryl Neat comes remotely to lead us in singing this great hymn, let us together pray the first verse. Have thine own way, Lord. Have thine own way. Thou art the potter. I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will. While I am waiting, yielded and still. And now, let us sing it.
Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Search me and try me, Master, today. Whiter than snow, Lord, wash me just now, as in thy presence humbly I bow. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Wounded and weary, help me, I pray. Power, all power, surely is thine. Touch me and heal me, Savior divine. Fill with thy Spirit, till all shall see Christ only, always living in me.